Hello, everyone. Welcome to the USDA ReConnect Virtual Post Award Workshop. My name is George Oyegoke. I am the branch chief for the Post Loan Servicing and Engineering branch. I will be joined today by my colleague, GFR, General Field Representative, Mr. Shekinah Pepper. And today we will be delivering a presentation that's covering construction and advanced procedures. We're going to start with the slides and presentations and then transition into a 15-minute session of Q&A. Please note that today's presentation will be broadcasted through your computer speakers. We will be posting recordings of the presentation on the ReConnect website in coming days. To ask a question, please submit through the bottom left text box labeled Submit a Question, and we will answer your question as long as time permits. Also, please bear with us as we might encounter some technological challenges throughout the presentation. And with that, we shall be starting. This presentation is a very high-level overview of the contents in our program construction, ReConnect Program Construction Procedures Guide. A lot of all awardees by now should have received a copy of the updated version of the guide. We will address construction procedures, some of the general requirements, some of our standard RUS contract documents. We also will be covering funding procedures and a couple of slides on post-award reporting. For our introductory slide, let's see, I think we already did this. There were some changes for all the awardees. On your offer letter, you received the first version of the constructions and advanced procedures guide, an updated version, or the latest version was sent in with all the grant agreements that most of you should have already received by now. Here, and with that, I believe we will go into our first slide of the day, which would cover general guidelines and requirements. In this section, I plan to cover the introduction, some of the requirements that cuts across all construction types and procedures. For any work RUS approval is required for any work that is done, any work that departs from the scope of work that was included in the approved application. The work must also be covered by the environmental approval. I think everyone should be familiar with this requirements as part of the application process. But no construction must start until all environmental requirements have been concluded. There will be a letter coming from RUS notifying awardees once all those conditions have been met. And if you have any questions regarding what your status is with regards to the environmental requirements, I strongly encourage you that you consult or contact our office. Contact your GFR or you contact our office. All funded materials and equipment must comply with the Buy American provision in 7 CFR 1787. All construction that exceed the $250,000 threshold must be bonded. If a borrower is responsible for requiring that the contractors and the appropriate bonds are in place, and the Treasury, the state, the Department of Treasury maintains a list of sureties that are acceptable to provide these bonds. There is a link on here. As I indicated earlier, the presentation will be shared later, and so you could access this list. It is posted on the Department of Treasury's website. Title clearance. This is required for all building construction over $250,000. The evidence of that title clearance must be approved by RUS before the contract is executed. Also, as part of the equipment purchase, a software license may be required. Contract forms. So for the ReConnect program, awardees may use our standard RUS contract forms that are available on our website, or they could also elect to use non-RUS contract forms. For tower construction, the RUS Form 7783 contract or a non-RUS contract can be used. This would be the only construction type where funds will be encumbered and advanced on the FRS. All other 773 contracts will be funded under small-scale construction that we'll be addressing in upcoming slides. Now, moving on to small-scale construction, each construction category adds its limit. So for outside plant, the limit for outside plant construction would be $1 million for small-scale construction procedures. So if the awardee elects to use small-scale construction methods, they can only use those methods on construction that will not exceed that $1 million limit. For equipment, building construction, and the threshold for using small-scale construction method would be $100,000. Contract amendments. Prior RUS approval is required if any of the listed conditions apply. So when an approved contract, when there's a change in the terms, the condition, or the scope of work covered by an approved contract, prior RUS approval is required to amend that contract. Also, if the price of the contract price increases by over 20%, by 20% or more, then our prior RUS approval is required. And also, if the price increase causes an unbonded contract, which is a contract under $250,000, to require a performance bond. So a contract that is under $250,000 threshold is increased and now exceeds that threshold, prior RUS approval is required before that contract is amended. For non-RUS contracts, those contracts have to be approved prior to contract execution. So before the contract is even executed by the awardee and the contractor that's selected, a blank non-RUS contract must be submitted to RUS for review and approval consideration. RUS will not approve a contract if it does not include these three conditions: that if the contract is not covered by the approved application, if contract terms and conditions are vague, and if the contract presents unacceptable risk to RUS. Now, each non-RUS contract must include a provision that the contract is non-binding on all parties until RUS approval is granted. Affiliated transactions. So the accounting branch went into great detail yesterday on a presentation regarding accounting transactions, and we have a definition in here. This definition is I have some feedback coming here. I do apologize for that. RUS is required. RUS approval is required before awardees enter into affiliated transactions. Uh, uh, Usually, those affiliated transactions are covered under an affiliated services contract, which had already been approved or must be approved by RUS prior to even the submission of the contract. Now, for closeout documents, we have standard RUS closeout documents for RUS contracts. If a awardee elects to use a non-RUS contract, then the awardee would have to submit a non-RUS contract closeout documents that include the certification. Include certification, similar certifications as the standard RUS contract. On records, the accounting colleagues touched on this a bit yesterday, but RUS records, awardees are supposed to maintain all records. And that includes records required for all expenditures, advances, disbursements, contracts. They must be maintained until the facilities that are covered are permanently removed from service, or removal restoration activities have been completed, or the costs have been retired from accounting records. Construction schedule. Now, I believe this was addressed in the application side of it, but I will state that there is a 5-year construction schedule starting from when funds are released. There is no interim financing construction process for awardees that are familiar with other RUS programs that do have those. For the ReConnect program, there is no interim construction process. However, if an awardee elects to start construction after all environmental approvals have been secured and concluded, then the awardee is certainly free to do that. However, the awardee is proceeding at their own risk until the award is closed and funds are released. If for some reason the award is not closed and funds are not released, those contracts, the awardee is still on the contract, and the awardee will be responsible for those costs. Aside from pre-application expenses and work that's required to finalize environmental review, grant funds will not be approved for any purposes that were initiated prior to environmental approval. Next, I will go through our standard forms. These forms are available on our website. For professional services, RUS maintains contract forms 217 and 245. For equipment contracts, we have the 395 contract. For construction contracts, we have the 257 contract, the 515, and the 773 contract. Subcontract forms are the 282, and amendment forms are 238. To close out RUS standard contracts, the forms we have on our websites include the 284, the 506, and the 756. Now, the ReConnect guide goes into great detail as to what those forms cover and what type of construction they cover, and we have some of them addressed in upcoming slides also. With that, we will start with professional services contracts. Professional services contracts would cover engineering, architectural, and other professional services that an awardee may require. The awardee must obtain professional services from persons and firms that are not affiliated with any contractor, vendor, or manufacturer presently working with the awardee. The engineer or architect must be registered in the state in which construction or installation of facilities are being performed. Prior RUS approval is required for in-house engineering services that are performed by awardee staff. Some of this will be addressed in upcoming slides, and this is in bold, but I'm going to mention it again. Prior RUS approval is required for an affiliated services agreement. Once that affiliated services agreement is done, then professional services is approved by US. Professional services provided by affiliated companies will follow the steps addressed in the following slides. So for professional services, we have three categories. We have engineering services. Sometimes awardees elect to have an outside consultant that's licensed in the state in which they are deploying facilities. In some cases, if an awardee has experienced staff, they could choose to use in-house engineering, and that does require prior RUS approval. We have architectural services covered under professional services, and in some cases, you have other professional services, other professional firms, such as those that are working on providing environmental clearances, on helping get the environmental clearances cleared. So for outside consultant, when a borrower elects to use an outside consultant, our US contracts available are the 217 contract, which is the post-loan engineering services contract. And we also have the 245 contract, which is the special services contract. And the third option is, of course, the non-RUS contract, which an awardee can elect to use. Awardees must, again, this is repeating the same information, but we'll stress it again, that our awardee must request RUS approval to provide in-house engineering services. Once approval is granted, awardee will submit a detailed proposal describing the types of services to be provided, along with a detailed cost breakdown of the services. In-house engineering proposals can be based on the entire project or can be separated by service areas or types of services. Let's see, next slide. For architectural services, RUS also has two contract forms that can be used. The RUS Form 220 and also the 217 are available on our website for architectural services. The awardee may also elect to use a non-RUS contract. Again, please note that the architect must be licensed in the state where the facilities will be located. Other professional services. For other professional services, there are two options. An awardee could elect to use the RUS Form 245, which is our special services contract, and that's for entities that may be working on clearing environmental requirements, or the borrower could also elect to use a non-RUS contract. Please note again that if you are using a non-RUS contract, that contract has to be approved prior to the execution of the contract. Next slide. On contract approvals, once a contract has been executed, 3 copies of the executed contract or the executed RUS contract or non-RUS contract must be submitted for RUS approval. Once approval is documented, a copy will be sent to the engineer, and one of the other copy will be sent to the awardee. For closeouts on engineering contracts, awardees using a standard RUS contract would submit RUS Form 506, the final statement of engineering fees. For architectural contracts, the awardee using a standard RUS contract will submit a RUS Form 284. Similar certifications are required for non-RUS professional services contract or in-house engineering services proposals. Next slide, I will be covering equipment contracts. For equipment contracts, small-scale construction methods could be used, as mentioned earlier, for contracts including installation that fall under the $100,000 threshold. These small methods could be purchased using purchase orders and reimbursed through the work order process, or it could also use a standard contract. For equipment contracts over $100,000, a 395 contract or a non-RUS contract must be used. The purchase order cannot be used for equipment purchases, including installation that are over the $100,000 threshold. Now, should a borrower elect to use the furnish-only portion of the 395 contract, the installation can be done by the awardee staff using the work order method, and that is absolutely fine. Procurement methods. The engineer prepares the performance specifications and the requirements for the respective contract and then releases them to prospective suppliers. RUS does recommend that awardees obtain at least quotes from 3 different suppliers. However, the awardee can elect to negotiate. We'll go into this in more detail in upcoming slides. But please note that all awardees are required to comply with procurement guidelines in 2 CFR 200. And once a supplier has been selected, the awardee and supplier can enter into the contract. The next slide is a snapshot of a chart just showing the equipment procurement process, and summarizes the preceding slides on the steps that you need to take, depending on whether the equipment purchase crosses the $100,000 threshold or not. Similar to engineering contracts, once the contracts are executed, 3 copies of the executed contract or RUS contract or non-standard non-RUS contract are submitted to RUS for approval. Upon approval, 1 copy will be sent to the awardee, the other copy will be sent to the selected contractor. If RUS declines to approve the contract, the awardee will be notified in writing of the reasons why. For equipment contracts, the closeout that's used for RUS equipment contract forms is the RUS Form 756. If a awardee elects to use a non-RUS contract, then a non-RUS closeout form with similar certifications will be required. So I haven't finished the professional services and equipment slides. We will now go into outside plant and building tower construction. These are our construction contracts, and they can be performed by outside contractors or in-house staff. So we will describe the work order process in upcoming slides. When an outside contractor is selected, the borrower may execute the Form 773 contract, which is for miscellaneous construction work. Depending on the construction category, we have several limits. And my colleague, Mr. Shekinah Pepper, we go into more details on those. But you have the 773 for miscellaneous work, the 257, for building contracts, a 515 form for construction, most outside plant contract, and the borrower could also, the awardee could also elect to use a non-RUS contract. On the 773 contract, please note that there is a $1 million limit for outside plant contracts that should elect to use the 773 form. That is because the 773 form is used mostly for small-scale construction, and there is $1 million limit for small-scale outside plant construction. Any construction project, any outside plant construction project that exceeds the $1 million threshold, a 515 form or a non-RUS contract must be used. Now, there is no limit on the construction, or there's no annual limit on how many 773 contracts can be executed. The awardee is required to attach all drawings, the specs, the sketches, and the list of materials when using a 773 contract. Also, if the contract price exceeds $250,000, even though it is a 773 contract, a construction bond is required. The awardee may use non-award funds. Well, we'll have to use non-award funds to fund the construction and seek reimbursement once the construction is completed. Please note that the 773 contract does not have provisions for subcontracting, and we will address reimbursement procedures in our upcoming slides. Let's see. For the 515, the other major construction slides, we have the 515, the 257, and non-RUS contracts. In a similar manner, the engineer will prepare what's known as the plans and specs. And once that's all done to identify and specify the work that's to be performed, it is released to prospective contractors. All procurement transactions should be conducted in a manner that provides open and free competition pursuant to procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200. We encourage all contractors. The awardee is responsible for making sure that the contractor meets all federal, state, and local licensing requirements, as well as the insurance requirements. With that, I will transition to my colleague, Mr. Shekinah Pepper, who will then go into details on the construction, on specific construction types.
We there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe for a second and see.
Okay. Are we? Sorry about that. Is the audio back on? Okay, sorry about that. Having some technical difficulties here on the transition. All right, it's working. Sorry about that, a little technical difficulties. My name is Shekinah Pepper, and I am the Kansas and Alaska GFR. Some of you may know me from time in Oklahoma and Maine, where I served as a temporary GFR. We'll continue on where George left off with outside plant construction contracts. Outside plant construction, for outside plant exceeding $1 million, awardees can use RUS 515 or a non-standard RUS contract. For outside plant under $1 million or less, you can use a 515, a non-RUS contract, or small scale construction procedures, which will be mentioned and discussed further on. When the awardee furnishes materials under RUS Form 787, Supplement A to construction is added in, and we'll talk about this further on. This is also discussed in the Construction Procedures Guide. And if you're following along in your Construction Procedures Guide, this starts at page 14. For construction contracts outside plant, plans and specifications, RUS approved engineer to approve the plans and specifications for outside plants exceeding $1 million. Plans and specs must be submitted to RUS for written approval. RUS will notify the awardee if approval is withheld, and awardees can solicit bids or negotiate upon written approval per RUS instructions in the guide. Plans and specs must also include special assembly units, details, cable layout maps, or any other owner-furnished material and associated unit costs. Negotiate upon written approval is based upon the type of funds that you use. We will get into the type of funds that you're using and whether negotiation or bidding is required in some of the future slides. Outside plant procurement methods. RUS contract, fewer than 3 bidders need to contact us. If you have less than 3 valid bids are received, then you need to contact us. If all conditions are met based upon the conditions in the guide, which begins on page 15, then you're able to execute. Prior approval is needed to execute the contract if all the conditions in the guide are not satisfied. For outside plant projects, including labor and materials estimated to exceed $1 million, this gets into the procurement process, and the funding type that you're using for your construction is very important. So on 100% loan awardees, RUS notification is required for negotiated contracts. That process is once you've gone into a negotiated contract under the 100% loan or match dollars, notification of RUS is through delivering the contract, approved contract. Several caveats when you're talking about the contracts that are executed is RUS does have the ability to deny contracts based upon affiliates if you didn't go through the appropriate affiliate process. Price, risk, and contract modifications could result in a denial. As George said earlier, non-RUS contracts need to be approved prior to execution. The bottom of page 17 of the contract guide also discusses contract documents in further detail. For outside plant, the combination of 50-50 loan grant awardees using loan funds or substituted loan funds may solicit bids or negotiate upon written plans and specs approval. RUS notification is required for negotiated contracts. And like I said, that notification is the submission of the contracts for approval. Grant funds will not supplement negotiated contracts unless the awardee received written approval to negotiate. And this is where it's really important to make sure that you understand when you're developing your contract where you're at between loan funds, match dollars, and grant funds. On the 100% grant, awardees must bid those out unless they receive permission to negotiate. However, the match funds, the same as the loan funds, can be used to, the match funds can be used under the same procedures as the loan funds, but the match dollars have to be bid out unless prior approval to negotiate is received. Outside plant construction procurement methods continued. For outside plants, including parts and labors estimated over $1 million or less, awardees may use small-scale construction procedures, which will be covered in upcoming slides, or they can bid or negotiate procedures following the 515 process. Outside plant construction contracts for outside plants, including parts and labors estimated to exceed $1 million, awardees must use the 515 or a non-RUS contract. $4 million or less, you can use the 515, a non-RUS contract, or follow the small scale construction procedures that we'll be following. The construction contracts for outside plant procedure, this is just a basic diagram that kind of shows you if outside plant construction is of $1 million or less, then RUS requires approval for plans and specs, RUS approval required to negotiate, and it basically walks you through that process that we just covered. Outside plant construction closeout. This is covered on page 18 of the guide if you're following along in that. Once acceptance tests and inspections are completed and all deficiencies corrected, the awardee must obtain from the architect or the engineer RUS Form 756, contract closeout certification, or a similar non-RUS contract. Documents are required to close out outside plant for Form 515 are listed in the guide. And on RUS will notify awardees in writing of approval of final fees permitting final payment. Building construction. All construction pertaining to the building structure must be performed under a single contract. For buildings estimated at no more than $100,000, form estimated at more than $100,000 must use Form 457. For unattended buildings estimated over $100,000, a non-RUS contract must be used. For buildings and improvements and unattended buildings estimated at under $100,000, small-scale construction procedures can be followed. Plans and specifications. Requirements for plans and specifications are provided in the construction procedures guide. All plans and specs must be submitted to RUS for approval, and awardee can solicit bids upon written receipt of plans and specs approval. Contract approval. Awardees must solicit bids for all building contracts. Contract award is subject to conditions detailed in the construction guide. And then 3 executed copies of RUS Form 257 to non-RUS contracts or non-RUS contracts must be submitted for RUS approval. To touch on this real quickly, we understand that with COVID-19 that some of our procedures have changed with regards to submitting copies. We don't need 3 PDF copies of the 217. Your GFR can instruct you on providing those documents to them for forward on to DC. We do need signatures scanned and provided to the GFR, and those will be forwarded on to DC. But you do need to keep copies of the executed documents in your records so that they can be provided to DC after the quarantine time period. It's a basic diagram for building and constructions for 100,000 or less, whether it's solicitation of the bids and the contracts used. For construction contracts, building improvements, all improvements have to have plans and specs, obtain at least 3 contractor bids, and then these are done under Form 773 contract. Upon closeout and completion of the plans and specs, the awardee must obtain engineer certification, RUS form 556, or a similar certification from a non-RUS contract and submit within 30 days. Documents required for RUS building contract form 257 are listed in the construction procedures guide, and RUS will notify awardees in writing of approval of final fees, permitting final payments to be made. Tower construction. General form 773, non-RUS contracts can be used for construction of all new towers and any improvement on existing towers. One thing to note is, as George mentioned, Form 773 does not allow for subcontracting. So if in your tower construction you are going to require subcontracting, one of the things that you'll want to look at is a non-standard or non-RUS form so that you could subcontract that. Plans and specs. The engineer will prepare plans and specs, which consist of the RUS form 773 or non-RUS form, diagrams, sketches, detailed specifications covering material and workmanship. Requirements for plans and specs are in the application guide on page 23. The awardee should obtain at least 3 contractor proposals, and neither the selection of the contractor nor the proposal require RUS approval. Solicit proposals from at least 3 contractors. The engineer will then review the proposals for compliance to the plans and specs and provide determination of the selected contractor, bid, tabulation of all quotes, and engineer recommendation for the contract award. Contract approval. 3 executed copies of the Form 773 or non-RUS contract form used in tower construction must be sent to RUS for approval. Anything over $250,000 contractor bond is required. Once again, the 3 copies, as we're working digitally, is not required for submittal through email, but your GFR can work with you on how they're requesting that email form come through for contracts. The award shall be made to the contractor whose quote is responsive to the plans and specs and most advantageous to the recipient's price, quality, and other factors that can be considered. Contract closeout. Upon completion of the contract, the awardee must obtain from the engineer the 556 contract closeout or similar certification and submit to RUS within 30 days. RUS will notify, once again, in writing, the final payment is permitted to be made. Construction contracts, tower contracting. This is a basic diagram for those. Construction contracts, subcontracts, and amendments. Non-RUS contracts can be used with non-RUS subcontracts can be used with non-RUS contract forms. However, once again, non-RUS subcontracts and contract forms must be approved prior to execution. Subcontract form 287 should be used with 257 buildings, equipment, and 515 outside plant. Minor modifications to the 282 are permissible provided they don't change the terms and conditions of the primary contract. RUS approval is not required per the ReConnect construction guides, which you need to look through the guide because it spells that out. Construction contracts and contract amendments. RUS amendment forms 238 for special equipment and for buildings. RUS amendment form 526 for the 515. Non-RUS, once again, non-RUS forms amendments can be used, but they have to be prior approved. RUS approval is required if there is changes to terms and conditions, the contract price is more than 20%, or it causes an unbonded contract to then be bonded. Minor construction, 773 work orders. Generally, awardee finances small-scale construction with non-award funds and then is reimbursed after the work has been completed. May also be used in conjunction with other RUS contract forms or non-RUS contracts. RUS Form 773 method, third-party selected contract meets all federal licensing requirements for work order and in-house staff. Daily timesheets, cost details, material supports must be kept. Cost accounting must be done per 2 CFR 200, which was talked about, I believe, yesterday. And we'll get into a little bit more on the cost accounting when we get into reimbursement. Used with modifications for small scale construction, neither contract nor selected contractor requires RUS approval. If it exceeds $250,000, bond is required. Upon completion of the final inspection, awardee obtains a final invoice, executed Form 743, certificate of contractor, and indemnity agreement. Certified RUS Form 771A detailed work order must be submitted to RUS for review. RUS Form 771A must be certified by an authorized representative and of the awardee and an approved RUS engineer. Work order. Second. Work order means any work that's performed by the awardee's employees pursuant to work order procedures, with the awardee furnishing the materials, equipment, tools, and transportation. Work order construction must be performed to all federal, state, and local requirements. Awardee must keep daily timesheets, material reports, reference work order project numbers to record labor and materials used. Cost accounting system, which was talked about yesterday, has to be followed. And then general field representative, the GFR does review. The GFR does a physical inspection of some or all of the work order projects before initialing the form, and the GFR will periodically audit the inspection and small scale instruction to include integrity. One of the things that you want to do when you're talking about work order procedures, small scale construction, is include your GFR often and to begin with, to ensure that you have the appropriate procedures in place at the beginning to ensure that nothing is disallowed after the process. Labor must be more than just something like John worked 4 hours on the 15th on this project. It has to go into what he was doing so that you can link his work with the approved purposes of the project and to what is allowed under the scope of the loan design. Before I get into advances and disbursements, I want to talk about real quick the GFR involvement with construction procedures under ReConnect. ReConnect is different from a lot of our other actually all of our other contracting procedures, and there's a lot of nuances to the system, as you can see, depending upon the type of loan funds you're using, type of contracts you're using, of what you can do and how you can do that. One of the things that we recommend is getting in touch with your GFR and going over your construction development plan, looking at each step and phase of your construction and determining, are we going to look at this? Is this going to be done in workhouse or in-house work order? Are we doing this under minor construction? Are we looking at a 515 contract? And then looking at the type of loan funds that you're using in conjunction with that procedure and that process, so that your GFR can help work you through that process. In addition, especially now under work orders, the GFR, it's difficult for us and we're under restriction based on the quarantine, to go out and inspect these things. Or the site may be difficult for us to get to. So under a work order for us to complete the inspection, there may be additional procedures that we're requiring. Some of my projects in Alaska, for work order procedures, I'm asking them to take a geotagged photo of the construction so that I can see when I'm closing out a work order or I'm inspecting it, where this site was at, the construction that was done, and verify that that work order was complete and done and in accordance with the project and in accordance with environmental rules, environmental approval, and project scope. Your GFR will be in contact with you towards the beginning of the project, and I think this is a great time to go through your construction plan, your reimbursement plan, and what you're looking at doing so that you can develop that procedure and that process so that the GFR is included often and has an understanding of what you're doing. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't change your procedures or your process as you move forward throughout it. We understand that things change, but this way the GFR can help identify any possible missteps or issues that could cause a possible disallowance of funds, which is something neither of us want. Moving into advance, disbursement, and ReConnect award funds. Definitions. An advance is transferring funds from RUS to the awardee's pledged deposit account. A disbursement is then the payment by the awardee out of the pledged deposit account for approved purposes. The pledged deposit account, which was talked about yesterday, the bank account that established to maintain and hold all awardee funds, and then the FRS, or the financial requirement statement, is the 481. It's used by awardee to request funds and draw down funding. Required forms. If you go to look at this website, which the GFR can also provide you with these links, gives you links to the PDF versions, the fillable forms of the 771A and the 481. Advance and disbursement of funds. Award documents contain provisions regarding advance and disbursement of award funds. All matching and or funds required for the project's completion as stated in award documents must be put in the pledged deposit account at the award closing. For purpose of advances, all matching funds will be treated as award funds and recorded on the FRS. If more funds are required than are available in a budget category, the awardee may request RUS approval. The awardee, for budget adjustments to use funds in another budget category, the request shall include an explanation as to why the adjustment is needed and how this is going to affect the different award categories. Any post-award budget adjustments and or system designs must be approved by RUS. Going into the pledged deposit account, which, if you're following along in your ReConnect construction guide, is on page 26. The pledged deposit account must be established in a bank depository where deposits are insured by FDIC. I won't go into this too much because it was covered in depth yesterday. Funds, RUS may require other funds, including match or equity general funds, to put in there, and funds must be dispersed only by FRS, approval of FRS. Fund advancement for approved purpose contracts. The outside plant construction contract up to 95% approved in advance, 5% withheld until closeout. Equipment and general construction is up to 90% approved for advance. Professional services up to 90% of advance. And then in-house engineering up to 100% supported. One of the things to remember on this is you can't just execute your contract and draw down 90% or 95%. The borrower shall only request advances as needed to meet obligations promptly. Generally, we do not approve advances requests for more than 60 days before the obligation is payable. There is a little bit because of the processing time that we can adjust on that 60-day time period, but this is something that you need to work with your GFR on when you're looking at requesting advance on funds prior to obligation payable. Fund advancement for approved purposes, pre-award expenses 100%, vehicles, operating work office equipment is 100%, and rights of way acquisitions permits are 100%. Fund advancement approved purposes. Bulletin 1770-1 describes the work order process. Our US Form 771A, the basis for advancing funds for work order, and Form 773 contracts. Forms must be certified by the borrower and the licensed engineer. They must be initialed by the GFR, and only completed work can be done under the 771A. When we're looking at small scale construction and we're looking at work orders and 771A, they must be a complete and distinct project that you can put into service once they're closed out. And once again, For the GFR to initial off on the 771A, they have the inspection process and they have to understand the process, which we'll go into the 771A here in a second. But the GFR has to be included in that process. So prior to starting work order, prior to starting small scale construction, it's advised to reach out to your GFR, make sure they're aware of what you're doing, and can address any problems prior to the work beginning versus trying to address those issues at the end. Small scale construction, RUS Form 771A, must be part of the approved design, must be supported by detailed project description, and identify all labor, including engineering services performed under the RUS 245 and material cost in the respective columns. And this is what you see is the Form 771A. If you look at it, there's the work order. On the first column, there's the work order number, labor and other material, or labor and other materials, and then total costs, and then net advance requested. Within the labor, there's always going to be an attachment to this, and each work order should include a brief description of the work performed that would allow the GFR to know exactly what was done and to be able to verify that that work was done in accordance with the project purposes and in the location in the PFSA that was approved for the project. The location for verification, the method of construction that was done, the date the work was completed. Now, in most cases, if you're wanting to break out and provide the details for this, materials have to be supported by invoices. Labor, you're going to have to provide timesheets and possibly additional information to show what all, not just the hours that were worked in the day that was worked, but what specifically was done in conjunction with this to show that it was approved project purposes. And this can all be done through an attachment. And I've seen it done multiple different ways, through PDFs, through Excel spreadsheets. Work with your GFR to ensure that the way that you're providing this information can be then reviewed and approved in order to help move the process along and to avoid any delays in approval. Advanced disbursement of funds. Once again, maximum value for outside plant construction is $1 million, or is the 100,000. No, wait, that's $1 million. That says 100,000 in that total column, but it's $1 million. Yeah, sorry about that. Advanced disbursement of funds, reimbursement work order construction for Form 773 contracts. The GFR reviews the supporting documentation. Like I said, project description, timesheets, invoices. Each work order is listed on the Form 771A. The GFR signs or initials that, and then the awardee submits the 771A and separate summary page gives a detailed description of work order with the FRS for reimbursement. Common GFR review questions that we're looking at, and like I said, I've covered these as we've kind of gone along, but was the 771A completed properly? Did you provide detailed project description? All the line item costs shown, and are they for completed work? And then has the awardee obtained proper documentation to support the materials and labors and those other things that were needed? Are all small scale construction projects part of the approved design? Was that part of the environmental approved? Has the staff engineer been approved by RUS? Is it an approved engineer, and did they sign on the form? And then did the awardee ensure performance bonds were secured for projects that were exceeding $250,000? And once again, coordinate early and often with your GFR. This will help ensure that you know the nuances of the programs, ensuring that you're using the appropriate funding with the appropriate documents and the appropriate procedures to ensure that we don't have any disallowances, which is something that, like I said, neither of us want. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to my counterpart, George, to finish out the rest of the advanced disbursements portion of this webinar. disbursements portion of this. What?
Sorry, I think we have some technical difficulties going on, but
Portion of this.
all right. I think I will take it from here. And I will be addressing the remaining slides and starting the Q&A session. Now, starting with the FRS, the Financial Requirement Statement. The Form 481 is the only form that is going to be used under the ReConnect grant or under the ReConnect program to draw down funds. There are no non-RUS forms for drawing down funds. So the 481 is on our website, and we ask that all awardees attach a cover letter describing the funds, type of funds they are requesting, how much of each, much of loan funds in case of a 50-50, how much of loan funds and grant funds, and when you have a grant, how much of grant funds, how much of the matching funds. In any case, this FRS must be signed by an authorized official. The signature on the FRS will be compared with the 675 certificate of authority that's submitted by each awardee during the release process. Also, the copy 4-page of the FRS must be signed. There are 2 certifications on the FRS. There is one on the copy 1 page and the second one on the copy 4-page. Both of them have to be signed by an authorized official. Only approved purposes must be listed on the FRS. So we have an approved purposes column. Those purposes will include the contracts that were approved by our US, and also tower contracts, which will be the 773 contracts that I mentioned earlier that were previously approved. Work orders are grouped. So there's only one line item for work orders. But for the most part, you cannot make any mistakes on the approved purposes column, because if you do, we will correct them. Total approved for advance would be noted in column 2 for each line item. And so the total funds that will be approved or advanced for each line item will not exceed the amount shown on column 2 unless an amendment or closeout has been approved by our US. Here's a snapshot of what the FRS looks like. We try to fit it on this page. However, if you want to take a look at it, it is available for download on our website, along with instructions on how to complete the FRS. Main items to note are that column 6 are disbursements from the pledge deposit account. So each awardee will be required to complete column 6 of the FRS. Our US program staff can make corrections to all other columns except for that column. Now, that column basically lists the amount of funds that you have dispersed for that purpose. That column 6 cannot exceed column 3, which is the total approved that's been advanced by our US. So for a contract example, if we have advanced $1 million for a contract, in column 6, your disbursements cannot exceed that $1 million, even though the contract may be for $5 million. Since our US has only advanced $1 million, you can only disperse $1 million, a maximum of $1 million for that contract. Line 17 is the construction fund account, the pledge deposit account. We use those terms interchangeably. But that is also a line item that has to be entered. So the certification below the FRS, the awardee is certifying to the amount listed in column 17 as the amount that is on the FRS as of the date that's noted on on column 6 of the FRS. When we receive them, if there are concerns, our US program staff will certainly reach out to the awardee using the phone number listed on the cover letter. On the next slide, we have a sample, well, a zoomed in sample of what these line items look like. So the first line item is our outside plant contract A1X. So the contract is for $100,000. 5% of it was withheld. So the column 1 shows 5%, $5,000, sorry. And column 2 shows the remaining $95,000. In this example, column 3 shows the awardee has already drawn down $30,000. And column 4 is where the awardee puts the amount that's been requested. As you can see, the borrower, the awardee is requesting $70,000 in this example. That would be challenging because that $70,000 would exceed the amounts available. The contract total approved for advance is $95,000. Our US haven't advanced $30,000. We can only approve $65,000 on this line item, pending the submission or approval of amendment or closeout documents. We'll pick also an example for the engineering contract A3E. The E is a suffix that you will see on all engineering contract. In that contract example, we have a contract for $30,000. 10% is withheld, the $3,000 in column 1. You have $27,000 left in column 2. In this example, the awardee has fully drawn down the maximum amount, $27,000 that's available pending the submission and approval of amendment and closeout documents. However, if you look at column 6, you will see this in this example, the awardee is showing $33,000. That is in red, showing that's a problem because that $33,000 exceeds the column 3 amount, which is $27,000, the funds approved advanced by our US. And not only that, it exceeds the total contract amount, which is the total of columns 1 and 2, which adds up to $30,000. So in a case like this would be an FRS that would be challenging, and this incorrect numbers has a direct impact on the number that's left in the construction fund account in line 17. And in this instance, a sample like this, an FRS like this, would have to be returned. We will not be able to process the request. Funding sequence. We addressed this a little bit earlier, and I believe our accounting department group mentioned this yesterday also. So for 50-50, where we have 50% loans, 50% grant funds. With the exception of pre-award expenses, all loan funds have to be fully drawn down before grant funds can be advanced. So in the case of that 50-50, all loan funds have to be advanced first before grant funds can be advanced. Pre-award expenses can still be funded by using grant funds, but that's the only exception. For 100% grants, awardee is similar. Pre-award expenses can be funded using grant funds. However, all matching, the required matching funds must be fully drawn down before additional grant funds can be advanced by our US. Post-award reporting. We have a number of post-award reporting that were included in the FOA when the FOA was released for the ReConnect program. I think many awardees are familiar with this, but we will also mention them again that we will need updates, annual updates to the service area maps showing where construction has been completed and areas that have been served. Also, while we're on this topic, on each closeout for outside plant construction projects, we will need we will be contacting each awardee or their engineer for the number of miles that was covered under the closeout. It's not something we normally request, but we are tracking and logging the number of miles on the contract and the number of miles completed, and program staff will be reaching out to either the awardee or the engineer to get that information on each closed out outside plant construction project. At the end of the award, at the end of the whole project, the awardee must submit a service area map showing all where construction has been completed as proposed in the application. Also, once everything is done, the project is completed. Residents and businesses in the service area must have access to 25 megabytes per second downstream service and 3 megabytes per second upstream service. All right, here are the tips for timely servicing responses. So as you can imagine, we will be servicing all awards that under this ReConnect program, and we have some different streamlining going on now because of COVID-19. However, this was prepared before then, so these are standard processes. Requests are addressed on a first come, first served basis. We make sure that all documents are executed by authorized officials. So where signatures are required, where awardee signatures are required, make sure they're signed by an authorized official. This is pre-COVID-19, but all documentation that have been submitted to Washington need to come in through traceable mail. Now, often the GFR gets to see to do the first preview. So we ask that you work very closely with your GFR. Even if you're still sending them packages via traceable mail to the GFRs will appreciate if you could scan a signed copy of your request and email it to them, and they can then forward that to us in the time being, pending the quarantine resolution of the quarantine situation. Please make sure complete documentation submitted. If you're submitting an FRS, we need both the copy 1 and the copy 4 pages. The certifications on both pages are similar but different, so that's why we cannot process in advance if we do not receive both pages of the certification included with the certifications. Minor oversights can cause major delays. This is very true. We have received in the past contracts that were signed by the awardee and not the contractor. In some cases, we have contracts that were signed by the contractor and awardee signature was missing. Be realistic with timeframes. Typically, we have 30 days to process complete funding requests. Our average turnaround time is about 15 days outside of the COVID-19 situation, but we just ask that you be realistic with the reviews and approval. We are flexible. If there are certain things that need our immediate attention, please contact us, send an email, pick up the phone, give us a call, and we'll try and see if we could expedite or escalate anything that requires our immediate attention. However, that does not mean that awardees should delay their planning process. So if you want to go out to bid tomorrow, today is not a good day to send us a template of your non-RUS contract. That needs to be done well ahead of time, giving program staff enough time to review and those documents. Another important factor to note is to understanding some of the rules and requirements of the ReConnect program. We encourage all awardees to become very familiar with the ReConnect Construction Procedures Guide. We are going to refer to this guide, almost on each request that we get under the ReConnect program. So it's better for you to understand that guide. And if there are any questions, please contact your GFR or you can contact our office, and we'll try and resolve them as quickly as we can. Again, you plan your construction activities, keeping in mind seasonal construction windows. We do understand that the northern portion of the United States have shorter construction windows, so it is crucial that you plan accordingly and make sure you maintain records that are sufficient to meet procurement requirements into CFR 200. We have a lot of available resources available for ReConnect awardees. I think by now everyone's familiar with the ReConnect website. A lot of our forms are available. Actually, all of our forms are available on our webpage that's listed on the slide. And we also have a contact form or contact forms for all GFRs on our webpage. For all servicing questions, queries or inquiries, please feel free to contact our division directly. Main line is 202-720-1025. On the next slide, we have a snapshot of our website showing how to locate the construction forms. You click on the telecommunications forms, and that should lead you to the site with all the forms and the instructions for the respective forms. We do have some workshop sessions coming up tomorrow and on Monday. We encourage you all to register for this and attend these workshops. And with that, we'll transition to our question and answer session. I will read and answer the questions as time allows. Please bear with me while I organize and review these questions that are currently in our queue. We have received a lot of questions, so I think we have some time to address it. So far, we have about 149. Let's see. So the first question I have here: can engineering or staking start prior to all environmental conditions being met and passed? That is a very good question. As many of you know, ReConnect awards were obligated following three. We used three processes in awarding those making those awards. So depending on how the award was made, there may be some extra restrictions done. Now, if your award was obligated under the new amended environmental regulation, you cannot do any activity until all environmental conditions are met and until you've received RUS approval that all environmental requirements have been concluded. For those that were approved under the NPA, and they can start some staking. However, there should be no construction. There should be nothing related to construction, just what needs to be done to have environmental concluded. As those are the only activities that can be done. The next question: would RUS consider an upgrade from the application award showing fiber to the node on the award to a fiber to the premise. Okay. I'm going to assume this is kind of a change of method. As we indicated earlier, all changes to the system design approved by RUS need to be submitted for review. So if you are looking to change your design after the award has been made, that needs to be submitted to RUS by the awardee, and with justification of what's the rationale for the change, and also a detailed description of what the change entails. We will let you know if there are if we need to revisit environmental requirements. Some changes may require that we revisit the environmental approval and probably have it go through the process again to make sure there are no environmental concerns. But I ask on that very question that you start working with your GFR. Contact your GFR and start that conversation now. We have a question. Please elaborate on small-scale construction limits. If the scope of the outside plant project exceeds $1 million, what contract should be used? If the outside plant contract exceeds $1 million, the awardee can only use RUS Form 515 contract or a non-RUS contract. However, if the awardee elects to use a non-RUS contract, that contract needs to be approved prior to execution and after execution. But we have to review the contract first. So we ask that you send a blank copy of that contract right to your GFR, or we in turn forward it to Washington, and we will contact you if we have any questions or concerns. Next question. Do we have to keep payroll records if we are not using funds for an employee wages? That's a good question, and I will try to respond. I believe you meant if you're not using award funds. So if you're not using award funds and this is not related to your matching requirement, then you continue your operations as you've normally done them. Your payroll records, whatever you do in your payroll records is up to each awardee. However, if you are looking to draw down award funds for I don't want to say payroll, but for in-house construction or in-house engineering, as my colleague, the GFR, Mr. Pepper, mentioned, those have to be well documented. So those detailed cost sheets will include all labor costs and tie those labor costs to the ReConnect project that you're undergoing. Similarly, for match, you have to have detailed records to show that those in-house engineering costs or in-house construction costs are related to the project, assuming RUS has already approved your in-house construction or engineering if where RUS approval is required. But for payroll, ReConnect funds are not eligible for administrative or operating expenses, and that includes salaries, payroll, wages, and whatnot. So your regular payroll would not be eligible for ReConnect funds and would not be eligible for matching purposes if you have a 100% grant, unless you can tie those specific cost, the direct cost to the project, installation and whatnot. The next question, do all non-RUS amendments, subcontracts, inspection, closeout forms associated with a non-RUS contract need to be pre-approved by RUS prior to use by the project? Well, the short answer to that is yes. So when submitting the non-RUS contract, we strongly encourage awardees to include amendment, subcontract, if there are subcontracting provisions, closeout forms, non-RUS closeout forms that are going to be used for that contract. That way, the package is reviewed one time, and it helps streamline and hasten our approval process. Okay. Second part of that was, are these forms submitted when the proposed non-RUS contract is initially submitted for RUS review and approval? Well, yes. So those forms should be submitted prior to the contract execution, and so we expect to receive. If you expect that there will be subcontracting provisions, then we expect to see the subcontracting form. It's always safe to have amendment provisions in there and amendment forms, and obviously closeout inspection forms and closeout forms that are non-RUS in nature would have to be submitted with that package. The next question, if we have in-house engineering staff helping with the inspection of construction, will they require RUS approval? The answer is yes. I believe we covered that earlier in one of the slides. Under in-house engineering, prior RUS approval is required. Next question, does the $1 million outside plant small-scale construction limit pertain to the entire loan project, or is it per 773 contract? Okay, so the $1 million limit is per contract. It's not limited to just the 773. If you're using a non-RUS contract for small-scale construction, then you have that the $1 million limit is for small-scale construction. It's not for the entire loan. And so you could have, essentially, you could have multiple 773 contracts. However, we caution you that you not break up a major construction contract into smaller portions so they can fall under that $1 million limit. Each 773 contract should be for a discrete project, which means that once that project is completed, something is the project is placed in service. So if you are chopping, you have a main line that you're chopping into bits. So I would not encourage awardees to use to chop up that mainline construction into smaller bits so they can fit under the $1 million threshold, because that may create some challenges when the contracts get submitted. Professional services, can professional services include legal and accounting? This is a question that technically, yes, legal services and accounting services are professional services. However, there may be restrictions on what legal services and what accounting services will be eligible for award funds. So just keep that in mind. If I ask that If you have a specific question in mind, notify your GFR, consult our US, so we can get all program and accounting staff on board to make sure you are not executing a contract that we cannot fund. The next question: if the engineering and design is done in-house, does everything need to be approved by a professional engineer, or can it be done by those who are approved by RUS and then reviewed by the PE and stamped after approval? Well, this is interesting questions, and it goes into several areas. I will give a general response that each ReConnect award, the PE, an engineer PE's license stamp was required on each application. So we expect that a professional engineer was involved in producing that design, and so I don't know if a professional engineer will stamp work that was performed by someone else. I'm not sure if that is ethical or even legal in the state, but you would have to consult the state licensing board to see if that's permissible. But for most of the ones that we see, I think that may be challenging to have a PE stamp work that was done by others, where the PE was not involved. If you have a much more detailed question where you'd like us to at least you would like to consult with us, please contact your GFR. This is an intriguing question, and I'd like to have it addressed appropriately. So at least you have our written response once we review it. The next question: if we choose to use the RUS Form 245 for professional services, will these contracts need to be approved by RUS? Okay. So the 245 is often a contract that's used under small-scale procedures and is funded under small-scale reimbursement procedures. So that would be tied to a project, a small-scale project that will be listed on the Form 771A form, and will be funded using that vehicle. I think that's the 245 is not submitted to RUS for approval. That would be the short answer to that. Do engineering contracts fall under the same bonding requirements and dollar limitations for small-scale construction? Okay. So the bonding requirements are tied to construction. So engineering contracts do not require a bond. The dollar limitation is, I believe, the 245 contract is used for small scale, and the 217 contract, or non-RUS contract, is used for contracts that are not small scale, essentially. The next question: can equipment be included on the construction contract 773? Okay. So the 773 contract is typically for miscellaneous construction. The 395 contract is the contract vehicle that's mostly used for equipment purchases on, a furnish only or furnish and install basis. So if it's a small scale, I'm assuming that this is a small scale equipment purchase, and so you would be the awardee in this case will be using the purchase order process to procure the equipment, as we addressed in earlier slides. So I don't believe the contract from 773 is the correct vehicle for purchasing small scale equipment. I mean, for purchasing equipment. Okay, so the next question: are internal work orders limited to 250,000 per year, like other programs for Form 773? The short answer to that is no. So as I mentioned earlier, there are no annual limits to the 773 contracts. So the internal work orders are not limited to a certain amount per year. There are no limits. No annual limits. The next question: if a contract is undertaken with a non-RUS contract, can the closeout happen with an RUS contract or vice versa? Or does each type of contract require its matching closeout type? Okay. So the short answer to that is that if you're using a RUS contract, then you have to use a standard RUS contract. You have to use a RUS closeout form. If you're using a non-RUS contract, you have to use a non-RUS closeout form. Same thing with amendments. So if you're amending a RUS contract, you have to use the RUS amendment forms that are available on our website. If you're amending a non-RUS contract, then that non-RUS contract would require a non-RUS amendment form that's hopefully been pre-approved by RUS. The next question: do the equipment contracts apply to purchasing construction equipment to perform in-house construction? I'm a little bit confused with this question, but I will try to guess what the I'm thinking the awardee in this case wants to purchase construction equipment. So construction equipment are funded based on itemized invoices. So if you refer to page 20, I believe it's 25 of your construction procedures guide. I'm sorry, page 27 of your construction procedures guide. It lists the supporting documents that can be submitted for operating equipment. So an equipment contract cannot be used for construction equipment. Can equipment be included in a Form 515 contract and not be on a separate equipment contract? Okay, that's a great question. So the 515 contract has standard RUS work units, and we do not have work units for equipment on a 515. So equipment purchases have to be made on a separate equipment contract. However, if you are handing the equipment over to the contractor for installation, they can be included on the 515 contract as owner furnished materials. So there's a process that's described on the construction procedures guide on how to document owner furnished materials. If you're using a standard RUS form, the 787 is the correct form that you will be using for to document the owner furnished materials. Affiliate companies considered contractors to the extent they would require the respective 515 or 773 contracts. Affiliated transactions are delicate. So prior to even executing a contract, RUS will need to review your affiliated services agreement that's signed by both parties. One, to make sure that it is consistent with requirements in 2 CFR 200. And once that agreement is approved by RUS, then the borrower, the awardee in this case, should they choose to use a 515, can use the 515 subject to the terms under the affiliated services contract. If the awardee chooses to use a non-RUS contract, that non-RUS contract, even though it is subject to the affiliated services agreement, the non-RUS contract needs to be submitted to RUS prior to the execution for review and approval consideration. So the next question, awardees must use non-award funds till construction is complete before reimbursement. Okay. Let me see. Let me try and address this question. I think I get where this awardees, what the question is awardees asking is prior to release of funds, if the awardee chooses to start construction once all environmental requirements have been concluded and the awardee has received RUS's approval to start construction, then the awardee will be using non-award funds. That is correct. The awardee will be using non-award funds for construction. Now, please note that this is not going to change the matching contribution in the case of a 100% grant that's required as a closing condition. So just because the awardee elects to start construction before release of funds and use non-award funds, the awardee is taking that risk and will still have to comply with the matching contribution requirement to close the award. Okay, so the next question, we say I'm trying to go as fast as possible. Next question, do you have to go out to bid using a 773 contract, or do you just need to get RUS to approve to use this contract? So I'm assuming this is for outside plant construction contract. So if you're using a 773 contract, you are the project is obviously under the $1 million limit. If it's under $1 million limit, you do not have to go through the formal bidding process, but you're not required to go out to bid if you're using the 773 contract. Although we do ask awardees to be conscious that these are federal funds, and I'm sure everyone participated in the call with accounting yesterday, and so you're going to have to document that these costs are reasonable. And so we encourage everyone to follow procurement procedure, federal procurement procedures into CFR 200. Let's see, I think that took care of that. Okay, the next question is a rather long one. I have 100% loan awardee, and they want to negotiate with a contractor for the buried construction of the project. Do I need to get approval of the contract document before I get the pricing from the contractor, or go ahead and get the contract filled out with the pricing from the contractor and then get you to approve the contract? Well, the first thing is we need to know what type of contract you're trying to use. If you're using a standard 515 contract, our US 515 contract, prior RUS approval of the contract form is not required since you're using a standard contract available on our website. If you're using a non-standard contract, then that needs to be submitted to RUS for review and approval purposes. The next question, are drops to homes included in the price of outside plant construction? How about connecting CPE equipment at the home? We will likely use a different contractor to build the drops versus the contractor that will install and connect the equipment at the subscriber premise. Okay, so the first question, yes. So the drops are included, can be included in the outside plant construction contract. If you're using the 515 contract, RUS has work units that identify the drops, and the surety companies that are bonding these contracts are very familiar with our US work units. So you can include those drops as part of the outside plant construction contract. Please note that the bond has to cover the entire contract. So if you have the contract also covering the installation of CPE equipment, or you're providing the CPE as owner furnished materials, OFM, those OFM costs have to be included on the contract and covered by the bond. If you have different contractors, the main contractor can subcontract. If you're using a 515, they can subcontract to have a subcontractor perform some of the other services that you don't want the main or the main contractor cannot perform. However, there are requirements on subcontracting. The surety and the awardee have to approve the selection of the subcontractor, and all these are covered in greater detail in the construction procedures guide. So in the interest of time, I think I've covered that, but if you'd like to have us address that in greater detail, please contact your GFR or email your GFR, and let's see if we can discuss the specifics of this particular case. There's a question here that says, is outside plant cost per PSA or overall award? I'm assuming that question is related to a construction cost. So the award was submitted there is a outside plan budget for the ReConnect award, for the ReConnect project. So for some awards, you have a combination of award and non-award funds. And some, the outside plan is covered 100% by award funds. So depending on what's on the budget, approved budget that was submitted with the application will guide how we encumber funds for outside plan construction. So there's a question here. We 100% staking be required under 515 before negotiations can start? The quick answer to that is yes, because staking needs to be completed for the engineer to be able to prepare the plans and specs, which would then be supplied to the contractor or the contractors. Should you be going out to bid, the plans and specs will be sent out to those, or if you're negotiating, then the plans and specs will be sent out to the contractor with which you are negotiating with. And so if the staking is not done, we don't see how you can have the plans and specs that's required to identify the scope of the project needed for negotiations. So the next question, can you describe the difference between bid and negotiate and when those can be used? Okay, so each construction category, as we presented, as different bidding requirements, and for outside plan construction, for major outside plan construction, those exceeding $1 million, borrowers can choose, awardees can elect to negotiate or bid the project. However, when you bid out the project, the guide details or the bidding requirements, soliciting bids from at least three contractors, having the pre-bid meeting, the pre-bid conference with these contractors. You need at least three bids to proceed. If you've received less than three bids, you need to consult with RUS before opening the bids. In the case of negotiations, that's well detailed. The only caveat to the negotiations that I would like to highlight is that should you choose to negotiate a contract that is being loan funded, and in the case of a loan grant combo, 50-50 award, should you run out of loan funds, you will not be able to use grant funds to supplement that negotiated loan contract. Now, if you have prior RUS approval to negotiate, then all options are on the table. So if you run out of funds with loans, then you can use grant funds to supplement that contract that was initially loan funded. So without repeating everything we addressed earlier, there are certain requirements for 100% awards, 50-50 loan grant awards, and 100% grant awards. So if you have a 100% grant award, you absolutely need RUS approval to negotiate. Prior RUS approval to negotiate. So the next question, we are 100% grant company. Do we have to get a construction company approved if we have a project under $1 million? No, RUS does not approve construction companies. we ask that you follow the requirements in the guide. Make sure the construction company that is selected is licensed if the state requires licensing. So we ask that you just follow state, local, and on the bonding requirements. So you know, if the contract is under $1 million but over 250,000, a bond is still required. So I think that answered that question. Can applicants include prefab buildings into the 515 contract for the contractor to prepare site and place building? So we had a section on the presentation that addressed buildings, and there's the guide specific guidance on prefab buildings. So I would ask that you review the ReConnect Program Construction Guide for the specific guidance regarding prefab building construction. But the short answer is you cannot use a 515 for a prefab building. I think I answered the next question already. Prefab buildings considered building construction. Some may cost slightly more than $100,000, but it's not a true building construction. Please advise. Again, review the slides that we had previously presented on the building, but I ask that you actually review the details in the guide because they go into greater details as to, especially regarding prefab buildings and what contracts you can and cannot use. So the next question, for small-scale outside plant construction, did you say that 773 does not allow for subcontractors? If so, what is the contract you would use? So yes, the 773 contract does not have provisions for subcontracting. As a result, you cannot use subcontractors on a 773 contract. However, if you want to use a non-standard contract, non-RUS contract, you certainly can, as long as you submit a contract to RUS for review prior to contract execution. And I just must state here that RUS may not approve some contracts if, in our judgment, those contracts will not accomplish award purposes, if the fees are unreasonable, and if the contracts present unacceptable risk to RUS. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think we mentioned it, but it is also detailed on page 11 of the construction guide, procedures guide. Okay. Is Form 786 required to be completed for RFP? All right. So for the sake of those that are not familiar with this form, this is a bid bond form that's used by under our electric program. For the telecom program, we have a bid bond form. It's a 307 form. Now, RFP, depending on whether this is a small scale construction or not, the guidance may change. However, if you're preparing the specs, part of say, for example, outside plant construction that's over $1 million, and you're going out to bid, a bid bond will be required. So the contractors will be required to, that submitting bids will be required to submit also the Form 307, which is the contractor's bid bond. Instructions for the bond, the form itself, and its instructions are available on our website. Next question. When you say an approved RUS engineer, do you mean an employee of RUS or approved contractor? Where would you need such a person? Okay. I think we mentioned that awardees can procure engineering services from outside consultants that are licensed in the state in which the facilities are being deployed, or they can use internal staff if subject to RUS approval. I don't think approved RUS engineer was mentioned, but RUS approved. There is no. Let's see. Yeah, I think this question's a little bit off, but those are the options. You can have a third-party consultant, or you can use in-house engineering, obviously with RUS's approval. Okay, next question. Under the 515 contract, will 50% of the work be required by prime contractor? That is correct. So the 515 contract includes a non-assignment section where the provision requires that the contractor performs majority of the work. That means the contractor has to perform at least 51% of the work covered under the contract. The contractor may subcontract up to 49% of the labor. So I need to make that clear. Or the 49% of the labor cost can be subcontracted. Can the owner draw down outside plant material cost as soon as the contract is approved, such as in traditional RUS contracts? Okay. So the contract covers material and labor costs, and as my colleague Mr. Pepper mentioned earlier, awardees can draw down what's funds needed to cover 60 days anticipated bills, and not much more than that. However, if the borrower is, or the awardee in this case, is supplying owner-furnished materials, there are no withheld amounts, no funds withheld on owner-furnished materials. So the awardee can draw down funds for owner-furnished materials. However, we put a word of caution. At closeout, we would need all the forms tied with the owner-furnished materials submitted with the closeout. So the Form 281 and the 724 will need to be submitted with the closeout 756 if you are using the 515. If you are using a non-RUS contract, similar non-RUS forms would have to be created, reviewed by RUS, and after approval, submitted to document owner-furnished materials. Will RUS need to approve of 245 miscellaneous contract? I believe we addressed this earlier, or a version of this contract. The 245 contract is used for small scale construction that are often funded on a reimbursement basis, once the project is completed and placed into service. So we will not, our US will not be approving the 245 contract, and it will not be funded like other contracts until the project is done. So funding will be through the 771A form, which would document the small scale, which was addressed under small scale reimbursement procedures. Let's see, next question. Oh, we still have a bunch of questions to go. All right, let's see. Will a 245 contract be required for pre-app costs? I'm going to table this question because we need to know what type of pre-app cost you're referring to. So there are some pre-app costs that are eligible and some costs that are not eligible. So we'll probably need more details before we can answer that question, accurately answer that question. Okay, I got a comment on here about where to find the FRS. The FRS to draw down funds is the form 481. That 481 form is also on our website along with all our other forms. I had a screenshot earlier of where it was, and you can retrieve those when it's time to draw down funds. We have a PDF version online and also an Excel version online that's fillable. There's a question here: will RURs prepare the initial FRS with budget numbers like with the infrastructure program? No, RURs will not be preparing any FRSs. The FRS is prepared by the borrower and once by the awardee in this case. And once it's approved, we will attach a copy of the approved FRS to approval documents that are then sent to the awardee. Next question. Do you want us to keep track of cable mileage or miles of area service? And the answer to that is yes. So our US is going to be asking, we are tracking the mileage and the application and the ER. And then with each outside plant contract that's submitted to our US, we are tracking the mileage. And upon completion of the outside plant construction project, we are going to be asking for mileage information. So we ask all awardees and their engineering firms to make sure they are tracking the mileage constructed so that at closeout, when we ask for that information, is readily available. We normally don't ask for as-built maps at closeout, but we may ask for them if there are concerns or questions or additional questions. Okay, I have a question there on pre-award expenses again. Will we be informed as to what eligible pre-award expenses are? Is it engineering, permitting, research, staff labor? I would point you to the construction procedures guide. There are some pre-award expenses that are eligible. Just staff salaries are not, unless you can tie them to the project, assuming that you have received RUS's approval to start construction, documenting that all environmental requirements have been met and concluded. Okay. I will take a couple more questions and then hand over the questions to GFR Mr. Pepper to proceed. So our municipality has received notice from RUS that environmental review is complete, so we may begin construction. Does that mean we need not be concerned with the NEPA process? The NEPA process, you cannot start construction if you still have to go through the NEPA process. So just because the environmental review is completed, there are additional requirements. You may have additional requirements with your grants. It could be Section 106 requirements or NEPA requirement process to conclude. All of those have to be concluded before you can start construction. And once the consultation is all done, you will receive a letter from RUS letting you know that all environmental the processes, NEPA or be it NEPA or Section 106, are being concluded, and that now you may begin construction. Okay, next question. On a 50-50 grant, on a 50-50 loan grant, if we draw down the loan first and then manage to finish the project on the budget, will the loan funds be adjusted to grants accordingly so it's truly 50-50, or we will be out of the grant money? The short answer to that is that you will be out of the grant money. So if you are able to complete the project in a cost-effective manner where you no longer need grant funds, then the project will be just loan funded. If we are building our own outside plant construction, do we need any contract forms using small scale construction and the work order process? I would ask that if you plan on using internal forces, you consult with your GFR immediately. The GFR will guide you, but you cannot execute a contract with yourself. So there is a process that you would have to go through. You mentioned using small scale construction, so you will be following the small scale construction procedures in the guide. If a grant award was made for $1 million, but the project ends up costing $1.5 million, can the award amount be amended? The answer is no. The award amount, as documented in your agreement, cannot be increased. The borrower or the awardee in this case is responsible for funding the overage. We got another question on in-house construction. What contract would you utilize using in-house construction? I believe we already addressed that. Please consult with a GFR for your state so that you can get guidance, but you cannot use a contract. You cannot execute a contract with yourself. So you will not be using a contract for in-house construction. but I ask that you again go through the guide and look at review the sections on in-house construction and coordinate real closely with your GFR on how to proceed on that front. We are a grant awardee if we have an affiliate company and plan to use that affiliate company for our construction effort. Would they require a 773 or 515 between affiliates, or would we still require bids, or would we simply coordinate with the GFR and establish in the company contract and assign to work order the estimated construction cost accordingly? If you have an affiliated company, I would strongly suggest you coordinate with your GFR. The affiliated services agreement has to be reviewed and approved by RUS before you can even execute any contracts. So we would need to review and the affiliated services agreement. You did mention that this is a 100% grant, which means that to negotiate with your affiliate, you would need prior RUS approval. Again, that's something you're going to have to walk through with your GFR that has to be approved in writing by RUS before you can negotiate, because this is a 100% grant. There's a comment here: rubber stamping is not accepted. Work must be performed under the direct supervision of the approved PE or RA. That is very correct. Thank you for that comment. I believe we addressed that earlier, that we don't think that would be ethical or even legal for a PE to stamp work that was performed by others that were not under his supervision, under his direct supervision. The next question: is there a limit to how much internal or no contract, no bid construction that can be done on a Form 773? There are no limits on the 773 contract as we have in other programs. However, if you're talking about outside plant construction, a 773 contract cannot be used for a construction project that exceeds $1 million. So may have missed this somewhere during the presentation, but do we have to bid out the project to the contractors like we do on a normal 515? Well, we encourage awardees to bid out their projects. However, they can elect to negotiate subject to what type of the award they received. Some, if it is a 100% grant award, then prior RUS approval must be obtained before the awardee goes out to negotiate. There are restrictions on supplemental funds if it's a 50-50. The use of on a negotiated loan contract, should loan funds run out, the awardee would have to fund the rest of that contract because it was negotiated without prior RUS approval. Grant funds will not be used to supplement such contracts. I have an interesting question here. How long would a non-RUS contract review typically take? It depends on the non-RUS contract. Oftentimes, we may need to involve our Office of General Counsel if we have contract terms that are of concern. Other times we may need to involve our program accounting group if there are some, concerns about some conflicts with our U.S. Rules or regulations or even statute. So it's all going to depend on how long it takes. If the contract includes as subcontracting provisions, amendment provisions, and whatnot, all those forms would have to be reviewed along with the contract, same as the closeout, to make sure that that contract is acceptable to our US. Regarding the use of a non-RUS outside plant contract, is there a subcontracting percentage limit? No, there is no subcontracting percentage limit. It is up to the awardee and its engineer when developing the non-RUS contract to insert what limits they want on the non-RUS contract. However, I will caution you that some surety companies, if the contract's over 250,000, may have concerns, but that's something that the awardee and the engineer would have to, or the contractors would have to explore with the surety companies. The Department of Treasury maintains a list of acceptable sureties, so the contractors would have to check with them, see what limit, or the engineering firm will have to see what limits the sureties are comfortable with. But the surety companies are quite familiar with our US 515 contract. They do know that we have that 49% threshold for subcontracting on the 515, and they know that they have to approve on the subcontracts, approve the subcontracts that are submitted under the 515. Again, I have this question on the Form 786. I don't believe we use the Form 786 because that is used by electric program. The form that we use for the bid bond is the 307. There's a question about running legal ads for RFPs. Again, I would ask that you send specific details to your GFRs so we can take a look at that and see what exactly it is that you're trying to procure. Next question, can bids be requested on a unit basis with projected numbers of units? And will this allow bidding for a multi-year project before the full system final design is complete? So the design should be complete when the staking is done. And so once the staking is done, the plans and specs, the engineer will prepare the plans and specs and then release those units. Now, we have standard work units that are used with the 515. I'm assuming this is a site plan construction question. So the work units are on our website. We have detailed work units that the engineer would use, and those work units will then be included as part of the plans and specs and distributed to the contractors that are bidding on the project. So the project can, the borrower and the engineer determines the scope of the project. So if the borrower wants it to be a multi-year project, just have the contract reflect as such, and it will be that. But I believe the design has to be completed before that's done. Can the engineering contract include subcontracting? No. The engineering contract does not have provisions for subcontracting. That's engineer that's designing the network, that has designed the network or designing the network is responsible for testing and certifying that the network was built to the design that the engineer developed. And the engineer will be signing on a number of documents that are detailed in the procedures guide. And in the interest of time, we did not go over all the forms, but there are testing forms, there are closeout certifications and whatnot that the engineer will be signing. So the engineer cannot subcontract. Under a 50-50 loan grant combo, if we have a negotiated contract under the loan agreement, do we have to request approval to have negotiated contract using grant funds? Okay, if you intend to retain the ability to use grant funds for the contract, then before the contract is executed, even for the loan, our US must have reviewed and approved a request to negotiate. Can outside plant construction for one ReConnect project be completed using multiple outside plant contracts? Yes. With two different construction contractors? Yes. Or does the entire project have to be completed under a single construction contract? No. So a project award could have multiple outside plant contracts. You could have multiple engineering contracts. You could have multiple equipment contracts. As long as those contracts are supported by the budget that was approved, you should be fine. Can we start field engineering or route staking before we have environmental approval? Well, if the staking is needed to complete environmental work, then yes, you can do the staking. However, anything outside of that, I'm assuming this is for Section 106 type of thing. Then outside of that, you should not be doing any activities prior to environmental approval. Okay, we have a follow-up question on the environmental. And it looks like a question that we probably have to address offline. So it has to do with the NEPA process. Please send us an email with the details of this, along with a copy of the letter that you have, so that we can respond accordingly. I have another question on the non-RUS contract review timeline. I can't give a firm timeline because I don't know what's covered under each non-RUS contract. So each one is going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. We'll try our best to get everything processed and reviewed as soon as possible. I think the COVID-19 has introduced some challenges right now, but we're doing our best to make sure we can streamline the review process. So should we get a non-RUS contract, that contract will be distributed to all the program staff and accounting and possibly OGC that needs to take a look at it, just so we can get everyone's buy-in, and there are no surprises when come audit. Okay, I think we've addressed all the questions. I think one last question that I have here is bidding required for prefab, or at least 3 bids. Again, I'm going to ask you to go back to the guide on the prefab building and follow the requirements in that. With that, our time is up. I want to thank everyone who submitted a question and for joining our post-award workshop presentation. Please continue to use the ReConnect help desk. Staff, accountants, and GFRs are available to assist. Tomorrow, we will be hosting 3 sessions, 3 workshop sessions, and the sessions will cover the NEPA process, the Section 106 process. So I expect some of the questions that came up today will be addressed in detail tomorrow, and also working with USDA regional resources. On Monday, we will have our last round session, and we ask that you all join us. Thank you. And if you have any questions, or if there are any topics that we did not address, or you need additional information, please send an email to your GFR or contact your GFR, and we'll try to respond as soon as possible. Thanks, everybody.